By the end of this story, you will understand why a mother chose to humiliate her own daughter in front of thousands of strangers. You will understand why a fortune worth millions had been hidden inside one family's silence for more than 2 decades. And you will understand why the woman the entire internet called a monster may not have been the villain everyone assumed her to be. There is a reason this story spread across every corner of social media within 48 hours. There is a reason strangers who had never met this family found themselves crying at their desks, at red lights, in grocery store parking lots, unable to stop thinking about one sentence spoken on a graduation stage. Before we go any further, we need to go back to the exact moment everything began. Grace Whitmore stood in her cap and gown, holding a diploma that represented 4 years of sacrifice, sleepless nights, and a promise she had made to herself at 17 years old. Everyone around her was smiling. Families were cheering. Parents were hugging their children, snapping photos, wiping tears of pride from their cheeks. Grace searched the crowd until she found her mother, Diane Whitmore, standing near the front row. Grace ran toward her, arms open, tears of joy streaming down her face. She had waited her entire life for this moment, for her mother to finally look at her with pride instead of judgment. But instead of a hug, Diane stepped backward. Diane looked her daughter directly in the eyes. Her expression was cold, unreadable, almost rehearsed, as though she had practiced this moment in a mirror the night before. And then, in front of hundreds of strangers, she said the words that would follow Grace for the rest of her life. "Don't touch me. You're no longer my daughter." The stadium fell silent. Somewhere in the crowd, a phone camera turned on. Whispers spread faster than anyone could stop them. Grace stood frozen, her diploma still in her hand, unsure if she had heard her mother correctly. She wanted to ask why, to demand an explanation, but her voice would not come. All she could do was stand there, exposed, as an entire stadium watched her world quietly fall apart. She spent 22 years trying to make her mother proud. She never imagined the proudest day of her life would become the day she lost her family. Years later, those same faces from that stadium would see Diane Whitmore crying outside a mansion gate. They would see court papers with the Whitmore family name printed across the top. They would see a graduation photo, torn cleanly down the middle, framed on a wall for reasons nobody could explain. Nobody in that crowd could have guessed that this single sentence, spoken in front of hundreds of witnesses, was only the very beginning of a story far more complicated than anyone watching that day could have understood. What happened next shocked everyone who thought they knew this family. Before we go deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We would love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. To understand why Diane Whitmore said those words, we have to go back nearly 23 years, to a small hospital room in a quiet town in Ohio, where a young nurse named Diane held a newborn baby girl for the very first time. Diane had grown up with very little. Her own mother had struggled financially, and Diane had promised herself that her daughter would never know that kind of hardship. She had married Robert Whitmore, a hard-working mechanic with a gentle smile, and together, they had built a modest but happy life. But what almost no one outside that hospital room ever knew was that Grace had not been born to Diane at all. She had been born to a woman named Elizabeth Ashworth, a woman who never left that hospital alive. Elizabeth Ashworth had grown up nothing like the Ashworth name suggested. She was not born into wealth at all, but rather worked as an assistant at one of Charles's family companies, where the two met during a business trip that was never supposed to turn into anything more than a professional acquaintance. Colleagues who knew them both later described a relationship built quietly over nearly 2 years, one Charles kept hidden from almost everyone in his life, including the woman he had already promised to marry. Elizabeth, by every account, believed the relationship was far more serious than Charles ever intended it to be. And when she discovered she was pregnant, she believed, perhaps naively, that Charles would eventually choose her over the engagement his family had spent years arranging. Elizabeth Ashworth was 26 years old, unmarried, and pregnant with the child of a man named Charles Ashworth, a wealthy businessman from a prominent family 2 states away. Charles was already engaged to another woman when he learned Elizabeth was expecting, and rather than face the scandal, his family arranged for Elizabeth to relocate quietly during her pregnancy, away from prying eyes. Complications during delivery took Elizabeth's life within hours of Grace being born. Charles, terrified of the story reaching the press and destroying his family's reputation, along with his upcoming marriage, needed the child to disappear from the narrative entirely. Diane, working the maternity ward that same week, was approached quietly with an offer that would change 4 lives forever. The Ashworth family offered Diane a sum of money large enough to change her family's future, in exchange for one simple arrangement. Diane would list herself as the birth mother on the paperwork. She would raise the child as her own, ask no questions, and never speak of where the money came from. Robert, desperate to give his wife the family she wanted, and unaware of the full truth behind the arrangement, was told only that a distant relative had left them a modest inheritance. Diane accepted the money, signed the documents, and carried a newborn girl out of that hospital as though she had given birth to her herself. She named her Grace, a name she later admitted she chose because she felt she needed exactly that, grace, for what she had agreed to do. For the first few years, everything seemed exactly as it should. Neighbors described the Whitmores as the kind of family you would want living next door, warm, hardworking, and close. But beneath that warmth, something Diane could never fully explain had already begun to grow inside her. A quiet, corrosive guilt she carried every single day she looked at Grace and saw traces of a stranger's face rather than her own. There were small moments in those early years that Robert never fully understood at the time, moments he would only make sense of decades later. He remembered asking why Grace's baby photographs seemed to begin only a few days after her birth, with none from the hospital itself. He remembered a locked filing cabinet in the garage that Diane insisted was full of old tax documents, one she never once allowed him to open. He remembered Diane occasionally staring at Grace across the dinner table with an expression he could only describe as grief, though he could not explain grief for a child who was very much alive and sitting right in front of her. At the time, he assumed it was simply the exhaustion of new motherhood. He had no reason to imagine anything else. When Grace was 6 years old, her younger brother Tyler was born, this time biologically Diane's own child, and something in the household shifted immediately. Diane began comparing her children constantly, praising Tyler's every small achievement, while holding Grace to standards that seemed impossible for a child to meet. Grace later confided to friends that she remembered feeling as though she had to earn her mother's love, rather than simply receive it the way other children did. She never once suspected the reason. She assumed she was simply not good enough. By the time Grace turned 12, the comparisons had become a pattern impossible to ignore. Report cards, sports trophies, even the friends Grace chose, were measured against some invisible standard only Diane seemed to understand. Robert tried to smooth things over at home, reminding Diane gently that children were not meant to compete with one another, unaware that his wife's coldness toward Grace came from a guilt he did not know existed. Diane brushed off these conversations every time, insisting she only wanted the best for her children. Grace, desperate for approval she could never quite reach, threw herself into her studies. She earned straight A's every semester. She joined the debate team. She volunteered every weekend at a local shelter, often staying hours longer than required, simply to avoid going home to a house that never felt entirely hers. Still, no matter what she achieved, her mother's praise for Tyler always seemed to come first, and more freely. What Grace could not have known was that every time Diane looked at her daughter's achievements, she felt the weight of a secret pressing harder against her chest, a fear that one day, somehow, someone would discover exactly where this remarkable young woman had truly come from. One evening that Grace would remember for the rest of her life, she came home with a debate trophy, the first her school had won in nearly a decade, hoping finally to see something close to pride on her mother's face. Diane glanced at the trophy for only a moment, before turning back to help Tyler with a school project that was, by any objective measure, far less significant. Grace stood in the doorway holding her trophy for nearly a full minute, before quietly carrying it upstairs to her room, where it remained on a shelf that no one else in the house ever seemed to notice. She never mentioned another debate win at the dinner table again. She kept winning them anyway, but only for herself. When Grace turned 16, something happened that would quietly begin unraveling the secret Diane had buried for over a decade. Robert lost his job after the auto shop closed its doors for good. Money became tight almost overnight, and Diane's carefully controlled world began slipping out of her grip. It was during this period that a letter arrived from a law office in another state, addressed specifically to Diane, marked private and confidential. Diane read it alone in her bedroom, then locked it inside a drawer in her closet, a drawer she would return to many times over the following years. Always alone, always with the door closed. Robert noticed the letter, but was told it concerned an old insurance matter from years earlier. The letter, in fact, came from an attorney representing Charles Ashworth, the same man whose family had arranged Grace's adoption 23 years earlier. Charles had recently been diagnosed with a serious illness, and facing his own mortality, something in him had shifted. He wanted to know about the daughter he had never met, the daughter whose mother he had allowed the world to forget. He was not yet ready to reveal himself publicly, but he wanted updates, quiet reassurances that the arrangement had produced a healthy, happy life. Diane, terrified of what contact might eventually lead to, responded briefly, confirmed that Grace was thriving, and asked that no further contact be made. Charles agreed, for the time being. Over the next 2 years, more letters arrived, each one a little more insistent than the last. Charles's health continued declining, and with it, his guilt over a decision made more than 2 decades earlier grew heavier. Diane grew increasingly anxious during this period, and that anxiety often turned into criticism directed squarely at Grace. Though Grace had no understanding of why her mother's coldness seemed to intensify with each passing year. Friends who visited the house remembered tension they could not quite explain, arguments behind closed doors, and a distance growing between mother and daughter that seemed to widen with every passing month. Grace began spending more time at the library than at home, unaware she was quietly becoming the center of a secret battle she knew nothing about. It was during this difficult stretch that Grace met a woman named Carol Bennett, a retired school counselor who volunteered at the same shelter where Grace spent her weekends. Carol noticed something in Grace that reminded her of herself at that age, a quiet determination hidden behind constant self-doubt. Over the following 2 years, Carol became something of a mentor figure, encouraging Grace to apply for scholarships she never believed she deserved. When Grace was accepted into a university nearly 3 hours from home, with a full scholarship covering almost every expense, she expected her mother to finally be proud. Instead, Diane reacted with something closer to panic than resentment, though Grace could only interpret it as her mother once again finding a reason to withhold approval. What Grace never knew was that her acceptance letter arrived the very same week as another letter from the Ashworth family attorney, this one different from all the others. Charles Ashworth's condition had worsened significantly, and he had made a decision he no longer intended to reverse. He wanted to meet his daughter before he died. He wanted her to know the truth, and more than that, he intended to leave the majority of his estate directly to her, regardless of whether Diane approved. Diane sat with that letter for 3 days before locking it away with the others, telling no one, not even Robert. For the first time in over 2 decades, the secret she had guarded so carefully now belonged to someone else's timeline instead of her own. Grace left for college anyway, carrying guilt she could not fully explain, alongside genuine hope for a fresh start. The distance seemed to help at first. Phone calls with her mother grew shorter, but calmer. Grace excelled academically, eventually catching the attention of a professor named Richard Hale, who encouraged her to pursue graduate research in public health, a field Grace had grown passionate about after years of shelter work. Meanwhile, back home, Tyler had dropped out of community college twice, and money troubles at the Whitmore house had only grown worse. Robert eventually found steady work again, but the strain of those years had left permanent marks on a family that no paycheck could undo, and no one, especially Diane, could fully explain why. As Grace's graduation approached, Diane grew increasingly withdrawn. She canceled 2 scheduled visits to campus without explanation. She stopped answering certain phone calls from an unfamiliar number that had been reaching out to the house for weeks, a number belonging to Charles Ashworth's private attorney. Robert noticed his wife's hands trembling whenever mail arrived from that law office in a nearby county, though Diane always insisted it was nothing important. What Diane did not yet know was that Charles Ashworth had already made contact with the university, quietly confirming Grace's graduation date, and had privately decided that he intended to attend the ceremony himself, in person, 23 years after he had walked away from the daughter he had never once held. On the morning of the ceremony, family and friends gathered early, filling the stadium with laughter and anticipation. Robert arrived with flowers. Tyler, now 20 years old, arrived with a card he had written himself. Diane arrived last, quiet, distant, clutching her purse tightly against her chest, as though it contained something far heavier than makeup and keys. Inside that purse was the final letter from Charles Ashworth's attorney, delivered only 2 days earlier, confirming that Charles intended to reveal himself to Grace that very day, in person, after the ceremony ended. Diane had spent 48 hours trying to imagine every possible way this revelation could unfold, and in every version she imagined, she saw herself losing her daughter completely and permanently. Diane spent the entire ceremony scanning the crowd, searching every unfamiliar face for a stranger who might approach her daughter, a man she had never met in person, but had spent 23 years dreading regardless. She did not know Charles Ashworth's face. She had only ever seen his name printed at the bottom of legal letterhead. Every man in a suit who so much as glanced toward the graduating section sent a fresh wave of panic through her chest. She gripped Robert's hand so tightly during the opening remarks that he leaned over twice to ask if she was feeling unwell. She told him she was simply emotional, watching their daughter graduate, and technically, she was not lying. As Grace's name was called, and she walked across that stage with pride radiating from every step, Diane's expression remained frozen, unreadable, as though she were watching a stranger, rather than the daughter she had raised for 22 years. In her mind, she believed she had only minutes left before Charles Ashworth approached her daughter and revealed a truth Diane had spent over 2 decades trying to bury. She made a decision in those final moments that she would later admit, through tears, was the worst decision of her entire life. She decided that if she was going to lose Grace anyway, she would be the one to end it, on her own terms, before a stranger could take that moment away from her. In the final weeks of his life, Charles Ashworth spent most of his remaining strength on a single project, a letter he rewrote more than a dozen times, trying and failing to find words adequate for a daughter who had every reason to hate him and no reason to ever forgive him. His nurse later recalled him keeping a single photograph on his nightstand during those final weeks, a printed still from a university website announcing the graduating class, Grace's name circled in pen. Charles never told his wife or his other children about that photograph. He simply looked at it each night, a quiet penance for a decision he had made 23 years earlier, and had never once found the courage to undo, while there was still time to matter. And so when Grace ran toward her mother the instant the ceremony ended, arms open, expecting the embrace she had waited her entire life to receive, Diane stepped back and spoke the 7 words that would be replayed across social media for weeks. "Don't touch me. You're no longer my daughter." She said it not because she believed it, but because she believed, in that single desperate moment, that severing the bond herself might somehow soften whatever was about to come. She could not have been more wrong. Charles Ashworth, seated only a short distance away in the crowd, watched the entire moment unfold, and what he witnessed changed the course of everything that would happen over the following weeks. Charles Ashworth did not approach that day. Stunned by what he had just seen, he quietly left the stadium, returned to his hotel room, and spent the night rewriting the very documents his attorney had prepared for Grace's inheritance. What had originally been intended as a private, gentle introduction to a daughter he had never known now became something far more deliberate. Charles instructed his legal team to accelerate the transfer of his estate, a property worth several $1 million, including a lakeside mansion, directly into Grace's name, effective immediately upon his passing, which his doctors now estimated to be only weeks away. He also instructed them to prepare a letter, one that would eventually explain everything to the daughter he had failed for over 2 decades. Grace, meanwhile, spent the days following graduation in a fog of confusion and heartbreak. She returned to her dorm room, packed her belongings, and accepted an invitation from her mentor, Carol Bennett, to stay with her temporarily while she figured out her next steps. Video of the graduation moment had already begun circulating online, and strangers everywhere were forming their own theories about what kind of woman could say something so cruel to her own daughter in public. Some assumed drug involvement. Others assumed a hidden scandal on Grace's part. No one, not even Grace herself, could have imagined that the true explanation involved a hospital room in Ohio, a wealthy family's secret, and a father she had never known existed. Within 48 hours, the clip had been viewed millions of times across every major platform, often accompanied by dramatic captions asking what could possibly justify a mother saying something so devastating to her own child in public. Grace's boyfriend at the time, a fellow graduate student named Jason Cole, tried repeatedly to reach her, but Grace found herself unable to answer even the people who cared about her most, unwilling to explain something she did not understand herself. Her closest college friends organized a small gathering that weekend, less a celebration and more a quiet show of support, sitting with Grace for hours without asking a single question about what had happened, simply making sure she was not alone. Grace would later say that those few days of silence, surrounded by people who loved her without needing an explanation, were what allowed her to keep functioning at all. Professor Richard Hale, the mentor who had encouraged Grace toward her public health research, reached out personally as well, offering to delay an upcoming presentation Grace had been scheduled to give, an offer Grace ultimately declined, choosing instead to complete her obligations exactly as planned. Colleagues who watched her deliver that presentation days later, calm and composed despite everything unfolding around her, would later describe it as the moment they understood exactly the kind of resilience Grace had quietly built over the course of her entire life, long before anyone knew the reasons behind it. 3 weeks after graduation, Grace received a phone call from a law office she did not recognize, requesting a private meeting regarding, in the attorney's words, a matter of significant importance concerning her biological family. Grace assumed it was a mistake at first, calmly explaining that she had no biological family beyond the Whitmores. The attorney gently informed her that this was, in fact, precisely the matter they needed to discuss in person. Grace sat in stunned silence for nearly a full minute before agreeing to the meeting, her hands trembling as she ended the call. Somewhere inside her, a question she had never once thought to ask began forming for the very first time. What if the woman who raised her was not the woman who gave birth to her at all? The meeting took place in a quiet conference room 3 days later. Grace sat across from an attorney named Margaret Ruiz, who slid a folder across the table containing hospital records, signed adoption paperwork, and a handwritten letter from a man named Charles Ashworth, a name Grace had never heard in her entire life. Margaret explained gently that Charles had passed away only 4 days earlier, and that his final wishes included ensuring Grace learned the truth directly from his own words, rather than from lawyers or headlines. Grace read the letter twice before she could fully process what it said. Her biological mother had died giving birth to her. Her biological father had spent 23 years too afraid to know her and had left her nearly everything he owned. Margaret Ruiz explained one additional detail that made Grace's hands begin to shake for an entirely different reason. Charles Ashworth had, in fact, gone on to marry the woman he had been engaged to at the time of Elizabeth's death, and together they had raised 2 children, a son named Preston and a daughter named Caroline, both of whom were now adults with families of their own. Neither Preston nor Caroline had known of Grace's existence until reading their father's final will, only days earlier. Grace sat with this information for a long moment, absorbing the strange and disorienting realization that somewhere in the world, she had an entire half-brother and half-sister who had grown up with money, stability, and a father Grace herself had never once met, all while she had spent her own childhood fighting for scraps of approval in a house built partly on the money that same father had quietly provided. The letter explained everything Charles had never found the courage to say in person. He described Elizabeth, Grace's biological mother, as kind and full of life, someone he had loved more than he ever admitted publicly, someone whose death he blamed entirely on his own cowardice. He described the arrangement made with Diane Whitmore, the money exchanged, and the silence he had allowed to continue for over 2 decades out of fear for his own reputation. He wrote that watching Grace walk across that graduation stage, and watching the moment Diane pushed her away, had shown him more clearly than any letter or lawyer ever could exactly how much damage his silence had caused, not only to himself, but to the daughter and the wife who never should have had to carry his secret alone. Before leaving the attorney's office, Grace asked one final question, quietly, almost afraid of the answer. She asked where Elizabeth was buried. Margaret Ruiz provided the location of a small cemetery roughly 40 minutes away, a place Grace visited alone the following morning, before telling another living soul where she had gone. She stood in front of a modest headstone bearing a name she had never once heard spoken aloud in 22 years, tracing the engraved letters with her fingers. An elderly groundskeeper who had maintained that cemetery for decades happened to recognize the name and mentioned, almost in passing, that a woman matching Elizabeth's description used to volunteer at the same animal shelter 2 towns over, feeding stray cats every weekend before her passing, a detail that struck Grace immediately, given how much of her own life had been shaped by the very same instinct to show up quietly for creatures nobody else was paying attention to. Grace left that meeting in a state of complete disbelief, driving for nearly 2 hours before she could bring herself to call anyone. She called Robert first, the man who had raised her, fed her, walked her to her first day of school, and cheered louder than anyone else at every milestone of her life. Robert, hearing the truth for the first time himself, broke down on the phone, admitting through tears that he had never known any of it, that he had believed Grace was his biological daughter his entire life, and that nothing about the truth changed how much he loved her. It was, in many ways, the first honest conversation about family Grace had experienced in years, and it came from the one parent who had never once made her feel unworthy of love. Diane, meanwhile, had spent those same 3 weeks watching her family and her reputation crumble in ways she never anticipated. Video of the graduation moment had reached national news outlets. Neighbors who once described the Whitmores as the ideal family now crossed the street to avoid conversation. A book club Diane had attended every month for nearly 9 years quietly stopped inviting her, with one member later admitting to a local reporter that nobody quite knew how to sit across from her anymore without picturing that stadium moment playing on a loop. Tyler, learning for the first time that his sister was not biologically related to him, struggled to process feelings of confusion and betrayal of his own. Robert, devastated by decades of dishonesty he never knew he had been living inside, moved out of the house temporarily, unable to look at his wife without seeing the weight of everything she had hidden from him. Diane, once so consumed with controlling every outcome, now found herself with no control at all. Reporters began requesting interviews almost immediately, with 2 national morning shows separately offering Grace significant sums of money for her first public comments. Grace declined every request for nearly 8 months, choosing instead, on the advice of Carol Bennett, to protect whatever privacy remained for herself and for a family already unraveling in full public view. When she finally did agree to a single brief written statement, released quietly through her attorney, rather than delivered on camera, she asked only that people extend to her family the same privacy they would want extended to their own, adding that the full story was far more complicated and far more human than any single video clip could ever fully capture. The statement did little to slow the public's fascination, but it marked the first time Grace had spoken for herself since the ceremony, rather than being spoken about by everyone else. It was around this time that the court papers began arriving, the same documents that would later appear in photographs shared endlessly across social media. Charles Ashworth's estate required legal confirmation of Grace's inheritance, a lengthy process complicated further by public attention and by Preston Ashworth, Charles's biological son, who filed a formal challenge against the will within weeks of his father's death. Preston argued in court that his father had not been of sound mind when the final revisions were signed, pointing to the rapid decline in his health during his final months. Caroline, Preston's sister, chose not to join the challenge, later telling reporters privately that she believed her father's decision, however painful to accept, deserved to be honored rather than fought. The hearing stretched across nearly 4 months, drawing local news crews and eventually national attention, once reporters connected Grace's inheritance battle to the viral graduation video from months earlier. Preston's legal team attempted to portray Grace as an opportunist who had somehow manipulated a dying man, despite the fact that Grace had not known Charles Ashworth existed until after his passing. During this process, financial records surfaced showing the payments Diane had received over the years, the very money that had funded the Whitmore family's home, Grace's childhood, and even portions of Tyler's education. Diane, once terrified only of losing her daughter, now faced the added horror of the entire arrangement becoming public record, available for anyone, including her own son, to read in full detail. The judge ultimately ruled in Grace's favor, finding clear medical documentation that Charles Ashworth had been fully competent at the time the final documents were signed, and pointing specifically to the letter he had written explaining his reasoning in his own words. Preston, visibly frustrated outside the courthouse, told reporters gathered on the steps that he intended to accept the ruling, though he made it clear he still did not understand why his father had waited 23 years to make things right. Caroline, standing quietly beside her brother, later reached out to Grace privately, an outreach that would eventually grow into the first steady relationship Grace had with anyone from her biological father's side of the family. News of the ruling reignited public interest in the story, exactly as the original graduation video was beginning to fade from people's feeds. Diane, who had already lost her part-time position at a local pharmacy after her employer received complaints from customers who recognized her from the viral clip, now found herself the subject of a fresh wave of criticism, this time from commentators who accused her of profiting for years from a child she clearly never intended to love the way she loved her biological son. Diane rarely left the house during this period, and neighbors who once waved to her each morning began quietly avoiding eye contact altogether. Robert, still living separately at the time, later admitted that even he found it difficult to defend his wife to people who asked him directly how she could have kept something so significant hidden for so long. The mansion itself, the same lakeside estate glimpsed briefly in flashes at the beginning of this story, became the physical symbol of everything the Whitmore family had lost and everything Grace had unexpectedly gained. Grace, still processing grief for a mother she never had the chance to know, found herself legally inheriting a home she had never once set foot inside. She visited it for the first time, accompanied only by Carol Bennett and Robert, walking through rooms filled with photographs of a father she had only just learned existed, and in several photographs, unmistakably, a woman who shared Grace's exact eyes, exact smile, and exact quiet determination that Grace had spent her whole life believing came from nowhere in particular. Months passed. Grace made the decision to finish her graduate program despite everything happening around her, determined not to let the chaos define the future she had worked so hard to build. She used a portion of her inheritance to expand the very shelter where she had spent countless weekends as a teenager. The same shelter where Carol Bennett had first noticed a quiet, determined young woman searching for a place to belong. Robert eventually returned home, though the marriage between him and Diane remained fractured in ways neither of them expected to fully recover from. Tyler, still adjusting to a truth that reshaped his entire understanding of family, slowly began reaching out to Grace privately, uncertain how to rebuild something that had never technically been broken by blood, only by silence. Diane, for her part, spent those months in a kind of public and private exile, watching from a distance as the daughter she pushed away built a life increasingly separate from her own. It was nearly a year after the graduation ceremony that Diane finally appeared outside the gates of the Ashworth estate, the very mansion now legally belonging to Grace, asking quietly through an intercom for 5 minutes of her daughter's time. It was the same gate glimpsed in the earliest flashes of this story, the image of a mother standing outside a fence she no longer had any right to enter, waiting to see whether the daughter she had humiliated in front of thousands of strangers would choose to let her in, or leave her standing there, exactly as she had once left Grace standing alone on that stage. Grace stood at the window for several minutes before deciding what to do. The torn graduation photograph, taped back together with clear tape months earlier, sitting quietly on the table beside her. She thought about the stadium, the silence, the 7 words that had followed her across every headline for nearly a year. She thought about Robert, who had never once needed a blood test to prove how much he loved her. She thought about Elizabeth, a woman she would never get to know, and Charles, a man she had only ever met through a letter written by someone who was already dying. And finally, she thought about the woman standing outside the gate, still, after everything, the only mother she had ever actually had. Carol Bennett offered to walk down with her, gently reminding Grace that she owed her mother nothing at all, that whatever Grace decided in the next few minutes would be entirely correct simply because it was hers to decide. Robert, watching quietly from the doorway, said only that he would support Grace either way, whether she opened that gate or asked Diane to leave and never return. Grace stood there a moment longer, remembering the trophy no one had noticed, the 7 words that had followed her across every headline, and also, unexpectedly, the sound of her mother's voice reading to her at bedtime when she was small, before any of the comparisons had begun, before either of them had any idea what the future was quietly preparing to reveal. Grace walked down the long driveway alone, leaving Robert and Carol Bennett waiting near the house. She opened the gate herself, rather than buzzing it open from a distance, and for a long moment, mother and daughter simply stood facing each other in silence, neither one certain what words could possibly follow everything that had happened between them. Diane spoke first, her voice barely above a whisper, admitting that she had spent every day since that graduation wishing she could take back 7 words that had taken her less than 5 seconds to say. She did not ask for the estate. She did not ask for money. She said only that she wanted the chance, however small, to know her daughter honestly for the first time in both of their lives. Grace did not offer forgiveness that afternoon. Not fully, not all at once. What she offered instead was something more honest, an agreement to try, slowly, with clear boundaries neither of them had ever practiced setting before. She invited Diane inside, Not as the mother who had raised her under false pretenses, but as a woman willing to finally sit down and answer every question Grace had carried for over a year without complaint or excuse. They talked for nearly 4 hours that day, longer than they had spoken honestly in the previous decade combined. It was not a full reconciliation. It was a beginning, which for two people who had spent 22 years misunderstanding each other, was already more than either of them had expected to receive. In the year that followed, the Whitmore family slowly rebuilt itself into something neither familiar nor entirely new. Robert and Diane chose to stay together, though the first several months of counseling were, by Robert's own account, some of the hardest of his life. Their therapist worked with them not only on the secret itself, but on decades of quiet favoritism Diane had never fully admitted to, even to herself, until she was forced to hear Grace describe specific memories, the debate trophy, the report cards, the birthdays that always somehow centered on Tyler, one by one in a room where she could no longer explain them away. Robert, for his part, had to confront his own years of avoiding conflict at home, choosing peace over honesty, in ways that had allowed Diane's behavior to continue unchecked for far longer than either of them wanted to admit. Tyler, once unsettled by learning his sister was not biologically related to him, eventually admitted that the truth changed nothing about how he saw her, and the two grew closer than they had ever been as children, bonded now by choice rather than assumption. When Tyler graduated from a trade program the following year, having finally found direction after his earlier setbacks, Grace sat in the audience beside Robert, cheering loudly as his name was called, and when the ceremony ended, Tyler ran straight toward his sister, arms open, without a single moment of hesitation. Grace hugged him back immediately, and for a brief moment, standing in that ordinary school gymnasium, the two of them quietly rewrote the ending of the exact kind of moment that had once broken their family apart. Diane never fully escaped the public reputation that single stadium moment had given her, but those closest to her noticed a woman working, visibly and consistently, to become someone her daughter could eventually trust again. She attended therapy weekly, without fail, even during months when Grace was not yet ready to speak with her at all. She wrote letters she never sent, apologies she considered insufficient the moment she finished writing them. Carol Bennett, who had become something of a steady presence for the entire family by this point, once remarked that watching Diane during that year felt like watching someone learn, for the very first time in her adult life, how to sit with guilt without letting it turn into either denial or self-pity, a lesson Diane herself admitted she should have learned decades earlier. In the months between the court ruling and her graduation the following spring, Grace began seeing a therapist of her own for the first time in her life, someone entirely separate from Carol Bennett, someone who had no personal history with any member of the Whitmore or Ashworth families. Much of that work centered not on anger toward Diane, which Grace found came and went in waves she mostly understood, but on a quieter, harder question she had never expected to face. If so much of her personality, her drive, her instinct to care for people and animals no one else noticed, had come from a biological mother she never knew, rather than the woman who raised her, what did that mean about identity itself? About how much of who we become is inherited rather than built? Her therapist gently pushed back on the framing, reminding Grace that resilience is rarely inherited cleanly from one source, but built, piece by piece, from every person who shows up, whether by blood or by choice, and that Grace had in fact been shaped by both Elizabeth and Diane and Robert all at once, in ways that did not need to compete with one another for credit. Grace finished her graduate program the following spring, using a portion of her inheritance to expand the shelter where her story had quietly begun years earlier, now renamed the Elizabeth House, in honor of the mother she had never known, but whose determination she carried, in ways she was only beginning to understand. At the small ribbon-cutting ceremony, Grace invited only a handful of people: Robert, Tyler, Carol Bennett, and quietly, at the very back of the small crowd, Diane, who stood the entire event without saying a word, simply watching her daughter speak briefly about kindness, shown to strangers who have no way of repaying it. It was the first time Diane had appeared publicly beside Grace since the graduation, and local reporters who noticed her presence chose, respectfully, not to make it the story. Caroline became a regular presence in Grace's life over the following year, the two sisters slowly filling gaps neither had realized existed until they found each other, eventually spending holidays together and speaking on the phone most weeks. Preston, in time, reached out as well, less out of warmth than a reluctant respect for how Grace had handled a situation that would have broken most people entirely, and the two settled into a distant but civil relationship, built mostly around occasional messages and shared concern for their father's remaining business interests. And Diane, a woman once defined by a single cruel sentence spoken in front of thousands of strangers, spent every day afterward trying to become someone worthy of a second chance she knew she had not yet fully earned, understanding, perhaps for the first time in her life, that earning it would take considerably longer than the 5 seconds it had taken to lose it. What began as the worst moment of Grace Whitmore's life ultimately became the beginning of the only truly honest relationship she had ever had with her family. Sometimes the truth arrives too late to undo the damage it caused in hiding, but every so often, it arrives just in time to build something better in its place. This is a story, in the end, about exactly what its name suggests, about grace, freely given, painfully earned, and never quite guaranteed, but always, in some form, still possible.